Welcome to the Townsend Center and to this event as part of the Forum on the Humanities and the Public World that the Center has been sponsoring for a few years now. It might not seem obvious that the topic of gardens relates to the public world, and whether in fact it does is maybe something we'll get a chance to think or talk about, but it's certainly an important part of our lives individually and collectively, and it's really a delight to have Rebecca Solnit here with us this afternoon to help us identify what the question around gardens is, because we know they're the answer to something. I wanted to begin by saying, and will begin by saying, that Rebecca Solnit is a writer, but as I started to jot those words down, it struck me how little that could conceivably suggest. I mean that she is a writer in the sense that she writes words down on pages and publishes them in the form of books. But it actually says, I think, relatively little about what she, or only a part of what she does, because it seems to me from having read some of the things that she's written that what she does mostly is experience the world and live in it very deeply and intelligently, and with a tremendous sense of commitment and engagement and involvement, and that out of this, or as part of this, emerge the things that she writes and publishes as books. She's written many of them, and I'll just read you a few titles to give you a sense, in case you don't already know, of some of the themes that she's taken up. One entitled Wanderlust, A History of Walking, published in 2002. River of Shadows, Edward Muybridge and the Technological Wild West, which was a winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and of the Mark Linton History Prize. Hope in the Dark, Untold History's Wild Possibilities of 2006. And a title in a book that I especially like, Field Guide to Getting Lost, 2006. In 2003, she published As Eve Said to the Serpent on Landscape, Gender, and Art. And although I rarely, in fact, I can't recall an occasion on which I've read a blurb or part of a blurb as part of an introduction, this one struck me as so on target that I just couldn't resist quoting it. The word landscape, speaking of the book, the word landscape implies not only literal places, but also the ground on which we invent our lives and confront our innermost troubles and desires. The organic world to Rebecca Solnit gives rise to the social, political, and philosophical landscapes we inhabit. In these, and the blurb goes on to describe them as quirky, smart, and wryly humorous pieces, Solnit ranges across disciplines to explore nuclear test sites, deserts, clouds, caves, and the meaning of national borders, as well as ideas of the feminine and the sublime as they relate to our physical and psychological terrains. I think from that blurb you really get a sense of the way in which it struck me that the simple description writer seemed grossly somehow inadequate without further elaboration to describe what it is she does. She is the author of a forthcoming book, and I'm going to try to get the title right, Paradise Built in Hell, or Paradises Built in Hell. A Paradise Built in Hell, Extraordinary Communities Emerge Around Disasters. This afternoon, she's going to help us discover the question to which gardens are the answer. Rebecca Solnit.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here and a pleasure being on campus. You know, I just realized listening to the introduction, it's going to be a quarter century since I graduated from this place. And I used the library again today. And my books come out of experiences, but a lot of them are in the archives. And so it's lovely to see my friend Eddie here, who I've done a lot of, I think, experience and protest in the streets and things, but also my friend David Kessler, who's been one of my guardian angels at Bancroft. So this is really a work in progress. I'm still trying to figure it out, but I think all of us have noticed that I think gardening is to the inner city of this decade what hip hop was to the inner city of 25 years ago. There's, and everywhere else, there's a kind of gardening mania that seized the country. So, if gardens are the answer, what is the question? Harper's, am I audible? Oh, good. Harper's online weekly review began last month. The Congressional Budget Office announced that the Obama administration's budget proposals will create $9.3 trillion in deficit over the next decade. And First Lady Michelle Obama planted a vegetable garden. Should I read that sentence again? Harper's has that way with language, but still, it's we know what questions that garden is not an answer to already. It seemed at the time that the country was more concerned with the latter than the former. There were petitions, etc., to demand the Obamas plant a garden on the White House lawn. And this may be about the American weakness for confusing symbolic gestures with solutions and feeling more invested in dramas than in policies that actually affect us. So Michelle Obama has, at least in a photo op way, tilled the earth of the White House lawn, fulfilling a goal that Alice Waters had for the Clintons, and resuscitating the old Victory Garden there in the time of the Second World War. Such gardens are everywhere in the American landscape now, and so is the ferment of excitement about what they mean. The gardens are, to my eye, both wonderful and problematic, or perhaps it's that some are wonderful and some are problematic, or that it's their meanings or intents are. So this is in sections. 1, swords into spades, or what revolution looks like in our time. Let's start with something very large and up in the clouds, revolution. A leftist just wrote mournfully in The Nation magazine that there was supposed to be a revolution. You know, that kind of 60s plaintive? There was supposed to be... when I was a young activist, people still talked about after the revolution and believed in some sort of decisive event that would make everything different. An impossible event because a change in administration cannot bring a universal change of heart. And the process of changing imagination and culture is plodding, incremental, frustrating, comes complete with backlashes, and is wildly exciting if you slow down enough to see the broad spans of time across which real change occurs. A lot of people then were waiting for the revolution. A lot of people now have lost faith that there will be a revolution. The overthrow of the United States government seems fairly unlikely, but the transformation of everything around and despite it has been underway for decades, including radical transformation in the governments of many other countries. There was and is a revolution, just not one that looks the way that socialists and a lot of 60s radicals imagined it. The Sandinista revolution 30 years ago may have been the last of its kind. The revolutions that matter since then have been less interested in seizing and becoming the state than circumventing it to go straight to becoming other people doing other things without state permission. The 15-year-old Zapatista revolution, which never sought state power, and though badgered constantly was never defeated, is the revolution for our times, or really only the most dramatic of countless thousands, involving Native Americans and Indian farmers and South African cooperatives and Argentinian workplaces, and European utopian communities, and more and more. In the United States, the most obvious realm in which this has transpired is food and farming. Organic and urban and community-assisted and guerrilla agriculture are still small parts of the picture, but effective ones, a revolt against what transnational corporate food and capitalism generally produce. A slow, quiet revolt that occasionally becomes upscale connoisseurship, but also can be popular insurrection. We often understand revolution to mean the sudden overthrow of a regime, but the Industrial Revolution was an incremental change in everyday life and production that began a little over 2 centuries ago and never ended. If gardens are the answer, the question may be, what does revolution look like in our time, and what's it a revolution against? In this case, among other things, the alienation of production and consumption, the transformation of sustenance into weird commodities, the role of transnational corporations in the terms of our survival, the disembodiment of everyday life, and the loss of sight of the processes that sustain us, and maybe a certain loss of tactile pleasure as well. So, 2, seed sales. We started with something very large and conceptual. Now let's shift for a moment to something very small and tangible. There's one growth sector in the economy now, vegetable seeds. A new item on my local TV station website says, the economy has people ripping out their flower gardens to plant seeds. More people are riding out the recession by growing their own crops. Call it a growth spurt in the seed business. Oakland-based Katazawa Seed Company said vegetable seeds for January up from last year by more than a third. They say 85% of the customers are home gardeners. Other major seed companies are seeing big sales bumps as well. Burpee seed sales are reportedly up 20 to 30%, with seeds for tomatoes, carrots, and peppers the big sellers. Suddenly, everybody is gardening. Planting food seems like the right response to the strange, uncertain world we're in, and people want to be tillers of the earth, tied to something coherent, calm, tangible, and sensual, to an old, slow process whose result is sustenance itself. I asked a landscape architect who does a lot of hands-on work some years back, if gardens are the answer, what is the question? His quick reply was, what kind of soil do you have? That's one of the questions, especially if we let soil mean the larger question of the potentiality of a site to bring forth crops, which may be crops of community, of ideas, of resistance, of rebirth, of pleasure. You can argue that vegetable seeds are the seeds of the revolution, but the garden is an uneasy entity for a time, a way to both address the biggest questions and to duck them. Maybe the question could be, what's the best use of gardens, or uses, because gardens perform innumerable functions above and beyond function as a space where the natural and cultural are harmonized to some degree, and where food may be produced. Some gardens are described as retreats when they are really attacks, famously said the gardener, artist, and provocateur Ian Hamilton Finley. A garden as a retreat means a refuge, a place to withdraw from the world. A garden as an attack means an intervention in the world, a political statement, a way in which the small space of the garden can participate in a larger space that is society, politics, and ideas. Every garden negotiates its own relationship between retreat and attack, and in so doing illuminates, or maybe we should say delves into, the political questions of our time. Or leaving aside the militarized terms of retreat and attack, the garden can be a withdrawal from the world, or a piece of the world in which the gardener intervenes, or even a launching pad for intervention in the wider world. The food you grow in your garden can feed all kinds of things. And if planting vegetables allows you to retreat from Safeway and factory farming, that act is a political act and a political victory, maybe even an attack in the guise of a retreat. Everywhere gardens are being posed as a solution to major problems. Everywhere people are taking up gardening as an expression of who they want to be and what kind of a world they want to make. And as a realization of these things, the American Friends Service Committee started garden projects in Bosnia to provide both food security and a space where former enemies would work together tilling the earth. Actually, to get a garden plot, you had to be working with somebody from another, I'm tempted to use the word tribe, which I think is probably perfectly appropriate here. You couldn't just do it homogeneously within your own ethnic group. Garden projects like this exist nowadays in schoolyards around the country. It's a way of giving the kids exercise, contact with the soil, a relationship to systems of production, maybe some healthy food, science lessons, lessons in cooperation. We ask a lot from gardens nowadays. Alice Waters here has been a proponent of the Edible Schoolyards Project, which also aims to address childhood obesity and the terrible food a lot of kids eat at school, to change their relationship to foods and bodies and awareness of the systems they are part of. It's only in 1 acre of one schoolyard in Berkeley, but similar projects exist everywhere as part of what Waters calls the delicious revolution. The Alemany Farm in southern San Francisco has as its mission statement that is, quote, a project of the Alemany Resident Management Corporation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving conditions in the Alemany community, a 165-unit public housing development beset by high unemployment and recurring violence. The Alemany Resident Management Corporation believes that we can address the root causes of violence by providing youth with meaningful opportunities for advancement. Our fiscal sponsor is Renaissance Parents of Success, a Bayview Hunters Point organization, the strong record of helping at-risk teens. City slicker farms and other projects in impoverished inner-city Oakland share similar goals. These are gardens as ways of dealing with social problems and health problems, as well as economic problems and potentially ecological problems. They are demonstration farms, and that how they register in people's consciousness matters as much as how they register in people's bellies. Alamany Farm, for example, brings hundreds of school groups a year to see where food comes from and taste a little of it. It's truly a radical project, a farm that was originally tended by Slug, the San Francisco League of Urban Gardeners, neglected after the fall of Slug, and then reborn as a guerrilla garden in the hands of Antonio Roman Alcada and a few other young local guys in 2005, then legitimized again. Growing Power, based in the impoverished industrial city of Milwaukee, has as its mission: Growing Power transforms communities by supporting people from diverse backgrounds and the environments in which they live through the development of community food systems. These systems provide high-quality, safe, healthy, affordable food for all residents in the community. Will Allen, our chief executive officer, believes, if people can grow safe, healthy, affordable food, if they have access to land and clean water, this is transformative on every level in a community. I believe we cannot have a healthy communities without a healthy food system. Our goal is a simple one: to grow food, to grow minds, and to grow community. That may be a simple goal, but not a modest one. Suggests that gardening is an activity whose harvests are far more wide-ranging and deep than food. That is a social act with profound social possibilities. How many of you have gardens? Wow, we are in the East Bay, aren't we? Okay. Funny you request that. During the Slow Food Festival, I'm for slowness. It's just not that I am not slowness. During the Slow Food Festival in San Francisco, a big organic garden was created in front of San Francisco City Hall. During last summer, another demonstration garden was created at the Contemporary Art Center PS1 in Queens, called PF1 for Public Farm 1. It was an extravagant display of architectural daring. It was all these strange, did any of you see it? It was all these strange diagonals with kind of food bins, these barrels, growing it, and it looked like an insanely expensive way to grow some tomatoes and lettuces. But, never mind about architecture. But it did feature actual chickens who actually laid eggs and did grow quite a lot of produce. The artist Fritz Haig published a book recently on his Edible Estates project, which proposes the replacement of the domestic front lawn with a highly productive edible landscape. The artist Amy Franceschini, based in my town, East Bayers, created a Victory Garden project in San Francisco that led to the creation of several actual gardens. It also generated a revival of the discussion of the extraordinary success of the Victory Gardens of World War II, which San Francisco alone had thousands of gardens, including 800 food-producing plots in Golden Gate Park alone. A small part of the 20 million gardens that flourished during that war provided a huge portion of the nation's fresh produce. If gardens are sometimes attacks rather than retreats, then the Victory Gardens were seen as important weapons in the war. Some posters even showed root vegetables flying through the air like missiles. "Our food is fighting," said one poster, and "use spades, not ships," said another. Food was a weapon not against an enemy per se, but against the collapse of a system strained to its limits by the cost of war. Homegrown food nowadays can be a weapon in the food wars, on the other side of which is Archer's Daniel, Midland, and Monsanto, and the whole apparatus of factory farming and globalization and GMO agriculture, though it proceeds not by attack, but by withdrawal and the provision of alternatives. The East LA Community Farm, which at 14 acres was said to be the country's largest community garden, provided a serene social space and food security for the mostly Latino gardeners who tended the urban soil there. And when the developer who owned it decided to evict them and build a warehouse on the land, I think it was a warehouse for Walmart, symbolically enough, a small war erupted, a war that the community lost. Although this is definitely a case of gardens as attacks. This was the one where Daryl Hannah ended up in a tree for some weeks, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the urban farmers, however, moved on to farm on a larger scale outside the city, the urban garden having been a springboard for displaced people to find their place. In 2005, Dean Kuipers reported, The contrast with community gardens elsewhere in the city is shocking. These aren't tiny weekend projects with a few tomatoes and California poppies. The 330 spaces here are large, 20 by 30 feet, many of them doubled and tripled up into larger plots, crammed with a tropical density of native Mesoamerican plants, full-grown guava trees, avocados, tamarinds, and palms, draped in vines bearing huge pumpkins and chayotes, leaf vegetables, corn, seeds like chilipilin grown for spice, and rank upon rank of cactus cut for Nepales. The families who work these plots are all chosen to receive one because they're impoverished by USDA standards and use them to augment their household food supply. These are survival gardens. 3. Detroit, the model city. You laugh, but why? Because what? Because I'm from Michigan. I have stood in the bee buzzing meadows of Detroit and smelled the flowers on the breeze, and I have seen the wild pheasants of Detroit. I just want you to know. Which is really what sent me there in 2005, is the architect Teddy Cruz told me about that Detroit had gone back to nature so much that it was full of wild pheasants. Although I'm not sure it's true that the police were patrolling poachers. I'm not sure you can poach an inner city pheasant. I think they're the pheasants of the people. But so I decided I had to go to Detroit, and it turned into a big adventure. In Detroit, the Garden as Solution is addressing even larger problems, and it's in Detroit that I first became aware of how profound and powerful the urban gardening movement is. It started with meeting Grace Lee Boggs, who at 92 has been politically active in the city for more than half a century. She was born in Providence to Chinese immigrant parents, got a PhD in philosophy from Bryn Mawr in 1935, was a classic Marxist when she married the labor organizer Jimmy Boggs in 1953. Her thinking evolved along with the radical politics of the city itself. During the 1960s, the Boggses were dismissive of Martin Luther King Jr. and ardent about black power, but as Grace acknowledged when we sat down together at her big shady house in the central city, the black power movement, which was very powerful here, concentrated only on power, had no concept of the challenges that would face a black-powered administration. When Coleman Young took over as mayor, she said, he could start fixing racism in the police department and the fire department. But when it came time to do something about Henry Ford and General Motors, he was helpless. They thought that all we had to do was transform the system, that all the problems were on the other side. As the years went by, the Boggses began to focus less on putting new people in existing power structures and more on redefining or dismantling or doing end runs around the structures altogether. When she and Jimmy crusaded against Coleman Young's plan to revive the city around casinos, Young challenged them to come up with real alternatives, and they began to think about what a local sustainable economy would look like. They'd already begun to realize that Detroit's lack of participation in the mainstream offered an opportunity to do everything differently, that instead of retreating back to a better relationship to capitalism, to industry, to the mainstream, the city could move forward, turn its liabilities into assets, and create an economy entirely apart from the transnational webs of corporations and petroleum. Jimmy Boggs described his alternative vision in a 1988 speech at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Detroit. We have to get rid of the myth that there is something sacred about large-scale production for the national and international market, he said. We have to begin thinking of creating small enterprises which produce food, goods, and services for the local market. That is for our communities and for our city. In order to create these new enterprises, we need a view of our city which takes into consideration both the natural resources of our area and the existing potential skills and talents of Detroiters. Detroit was undergoing the most dramatic deindustrialization in the nation and the world in those days. It has lost half its population in the past 4 decades, and much of the industry that had made it a boomtown has fled. Not only the factories fled, abandoned houses were torched or decayed, and then the city scraped off their foundations, and by the time I visited it a few years ago, Detroit contained more than 40 square miles of vacant lots, often growing lushly, the prairie and forests weedily reseeding themselves, birds trilling, insects humming. 40 square miles is a green hole in the urban fabric nearly the size of San Francisco. What do you do with it? Detroit started farming. There are wild pheasants in downtown Detroit and also beehives, and at some point there was an alfalfa field, though I think it may be gone, but the apple orchard is there for keeps. And an important thing to notice about this gardening is that it further undoes the old divide between urban and rural, with the idea that food comes from the city and the city is a place of abstraction, disembodiment, mechanization. Cities are going agricultural green and topsoil brown. Now a lot of what you see is vacant lots, Grace told me. Most people see only disaster and the end of the world. On the other hand, artists in particular see the potential, the possibility of bringing the country back into the city, which is what we really need. Of course, it sounds like the title of Dick Walker's book, The Country and the City, which talks about the ways the Bay Area was never quite so tidily divided up. But this sort of reproduction of the cities as agriculture, that's happening everywhere. There's a bunch of projects in New York and Philly, et cetera, really sort of pushing that way of rethinking cities. I went to Detroit. I saw the lush 3-acre Earthworks community garden launched by a Capuchin monk in 1999, and now growing organic produce for the U.S. Department of Agriculture food programs. I saw a 4-H garden in a fairly ravaged East Side neighborhood, and amidst the utter abandonment of the West Side, I saw the handsome tiled buildings of the Ferguson Academy for Young Women, a school for teenage mothers that opens onto a working farm, complete with orchard, horses, ducks, long rows of cauliflower and broccoli, and a red barn the girls built themselves. I met Ashley Atkinson, the young project manager for the greening of Detroit, and heard about the 100 community gardens they support and the thousands more food gardens that are not part of any network. The food they produce, Atkinson told me, stands between many Detroiters and hunger. Urban farming, dollar for dollar, she said, is the most effective change agent you can have in a community. Everywhere I went, I saw the rich soil of Detroit and the hard work of the gardeners bringing forth an abundant harvest any organic farmer would envy. After the panic, and it's funny, I really went to Detroit thinking I was there to look at ruins and a few pheasants, but really ruins. And it was interesting realizing that the ruins were really a story from 20 years ago, and that something had to come after ruins. And that in some sense, if the city is the ruin of an organic landscape, then when the city falls into ruin, the organic landscape can be reborn. We think of ruins as being about death, but they often unpave the way, I think would be the right verb, for another kind of life. And so Detroit is very, very alive, and in strange ways. And there really are Tree of Heaven, also known as the ghetto palm, growing out of cracks on high rises and things like that. And it's an eerie landscape, but it's a very lush green one. After the Panic of 1893, Detroit's left-wing Republican mayor encouraged hungry citizens to plant potatoes in the city's vacant lots and went down in history as Potato Patch Pingree. Something similar happened to Cuba when the Soviet Union collapsed and the island lost its subsidized oil and thereby its mechanized agriculture. Through garden-scale semi-organic agriculture, Cubans clawed their way back to food security and got better food in the bargain. Much of it was and is grown in cities. The Cuban model is often used as an example for how to get by after oil goes away. Bicycles, localizing everything from education to medicine, and urban gardens that changed the Cuban diet for the better. Cubans didn't necessarily like all the changes. I don't think we will either. But they more or less worked. And the change is a great watershed, for Cuban agriculture was the industrialized outdoor factory model of classical socialism. And this didn't work in the post-oil era. Small-scale diversified hand-tilled and ox-tilled agriculture replaced it. Detroit is becoming another example, and in future decades it may be the shining example we can look to, the post-industrial green city that was once the iron-gray capital of Fordist manufacturing. The new world begins with gardens, or so everyone hopes nowadays. Gardens are, in the eyes of landscape historian Kenneth Helfand, themselves acts of hope. He writes, "The gardener has faith that what is planted will grow, and that as plants mature they will be cared for." Valhardin de Paradiso, a community garden on New York's Lower East Side, urban gardener Julie Kirkpatrick says, "You need a ray of hope, and you find it in seeing what can grow out of rubble." The metaphor of a garden lets us see that hope is not passive, wishing that food would miraculously spring forth from the soil, but active, planting, watering, tending, and then harvesting. You have to hope, but you have to also work. 4, a revolution, but against what? If gardens are the answer, what is the question can be replaced as if gardens are a revolution, what are they revolting against? In the garden, you don't toil for strangers, corporations, or the market. You don't earn wages. The food is produced directly, though you might swap or sell some of it. If you plant in 10 beets, you eat beets. You may... Shocking, but true. No, I perhaps, was that clear? This is really in contrast with the bizarre machinations of working for Widget Co. to make widgets for people on the other side of the globe so you can ultimately go to Safeway and eat something vaguely resembling beets. You may also harvest a sense of connection to the earth, to your own labor, as producing worthwhile fruits, to the neighbors, and to the relationship between food and body. You work for yourself, and work becomes an unregulated pleasure of senses and intent. The garden is a revolt against the very model of capitalism, and most particularly against its globalized forms, often quite explicitly so. Many of the new gardeners address both the social costs of alienation and food insecurity, the health costs of bad food, and the environmental costs of petroleum-based industrial agriculture. And in this, they're part of the food revolution that has brought us a whole new vocabulary in recent years: locavore, food miles, permaculture, and so forth. Food has been the principal means by which people understand and alter the systems we're all part of. It's been a revolution of awareness, rather like the on-campus sweatshop revolution of a decade or so ago, that made people conscious for the first time in a while that every artifact is made and that the condition of the maker is of concern. We're learning to see the complex, sprawling systems we're part of, and when they become visible, some of them, sweatshops, corporate agriculture, are so appalling, people are moved to reform or revolt. Thus the garden's proliferating everywhere. And it's funny for me, 20 years or so ago in the art world, people were really working to make work that was about systems and to make systems visible, and working across the whole spectrum. And it seemed like the only thing with that really stuck was food, and we're a little obsessed with food nowadays, and which often becomes a sort of very precious and elite preoccupation. But, it's not that it's objectionable that people are paying attention to those systems, only wishful thinking that more systems were visible, that people would be thinking about all of the flows of energy and resources and labor that they participate in. But food is a good start. And it's funny how much that's kind of recouping the loss of the Industrial Revolution, where processes became invisible, alienated, and remote. So rather than buying your wool from the guy whose sheep you saw in the village, you bought your sweater from Sears. And the desire to make the loops smaller is a big part of this new gardening. This is both a practical economic achievement in a time of dwindling jobs and collapsing economy, and a cultural triumph over the powerlessness and alienation that producing widgets for Widget Co. or writing about widgets for WidgetCom meant. It's also a means of reclaiming health in inner cities. In Detroit, it models a post-globalized, post-industrial economy, a landscape of survival. Even 4 years ago, when I was visiting Detroit, the new urban agriculture seemed enchanting, but also a bit harsh and unevenly applied. It seemed unfair in some ways that inner-city African Americans were the ones who had to go this route. It now seems that far more people in far more places are going the same route, that Detroit was just the prophetic landscape. Guerrilla gardens, victory gardens, urban farms, community gardens, lawn conversions, and other phenomena are now exploding around the country. The politics of prefiguration. The food garden is a major symbolic front in a revolt against corporate globalization and capitalism. That is, globalization has meant the race to the bottom in wages, the spread of maquiladora-style factories across the poorer parts of the world, the rise of deindustrialization and unemployment across the old manufacturing portions of the richer parts of the world, notably the American Rust Belt that includes Detroit and Milwaukee, the use of colossal amounts of fossil fuel both to produce the goods, whether Nikes or genetically modified corn, and to ship those goods great distances to foreign markets. It has meant the precariousness of local and individual entities dependent on transnational forces, not just beyond their own control, but often beyond their government's control. It's meant the loss of the ability to determine the future of your community. If NAFTA-era cheap corn from the agribusiness Midwest floods your Mexican village, the corn farmers go out of business and turn into displaced workers looking for jobs on the same side of the border the corn came from, with a net loss of well-being for both Mexico and its exiled citizens, if not for the corn corporations and the market. It's meant profligate petroleum consumption and so the destruction of the climate and the world. Of course, the curious thing about so many of those displaced migrants is that they end up tending our garden. One of the odd things about the anti-immigration movement is it tends to picture the United States as some kind of idyllic garden being invaded by alien outsiders, but from the illegal pot gardens in the national parks to the ornamental gardens of upscale LA to the major food gardens of the Salinas Valley and pretty much every place else in the country that the tending is being done for large part by Latino labor. Michael Pollan addressed these food politics in his letter last fall to the farmer-in-chief, describing the centrality of food politics to the well-being of this nation and the fate of the world. He said, "In the past several months, more than 30 nations have experienced food riots, and so far one government has fallen. Should high grain prices persist and shortages develop, you can expect to see the pendulum shift decisively away from free trade, at least in food. Nations that open their markets to the global flood of cheap grain, under pressure from previous administrations as well as the World Bank and the IMF, lost so many farmers that they now find their ability to feed their own populations hinges on decisions made in Washington, like your predecessors' precipitous embrace of biofuels, and on Wall Street. They will now rush to rebuild their own agricultural sectors and then seek to protect them by erecting trade barriers. Expect to hear the phrases food sovereignty and food security on the lips of every foreign leader you meet. Not only the Doha round, but the whole cause of free trade in agriculture is probably dead, the casualty of a cheap food policy that a scant 2 years ago seemed like a boon for everyone. It's one of the larger paradoxes of our time that the very same food policies that have contributed to overnutrition in the first world are now contributing to undernutrition in the third. But it turns out that too much food can be nearly as big a problem as too little, a lesson we should keep in mind as we set about designing a new approach to food policy. Rich or poor, countries struggling with soaring food prices are being forcibly reminded that food is a national security issue. When a nation loses the ability to substantially feed itself, it is not only at the mercy of global commodity markets, but of other governments as well. At issue is not only the availability of food, which may be held hostage by a hostile state, but its safety, as recent scandals in China demonstrate. We have little control over the safety of imported foods. Put this way, the other interesting thing about what Pollan has to say is that what was supposed to be the juggernaut of corporate globalization launched in the 90s under the Clinton administration with NAFTA and then the WTO, continues to collapse ever more dramatically. And that has been one of the major revolutions of our time. There was a very clear corporate vision before the Seattle WTO of essentially taking over the world and running it conveniently like it's one big market for those products. And this series of revolts, the Seattle WTO itself, in Cancun 4 years later, the complete collapse of the free trade area of the Americas Agreement in Argentina, the withdrawal of Latin America from a lot of the IMF, the World Bank kinds of controls, and these other kinds of revolts, including the Zapatistas who rose up the day that NAFTA went into effect 15 years ago, has been a revolution of sorts. That in some sense the food gardening in the United States is a small, self-conscious, and in some ways I think minor piece of, but a significant one. Gardening is a way to cut short the strange cycle Pollan describes, to cut out of the money economy almost altogether, to break the divide between urban and rural, production and consumption, pleasure and work, individual bodies and communities. Its main limitation, at least when it comes to the smaller gardens, is that it's a model rather than an all-encompassing solution. It is limited, but added to other parts of the food revolution, such as the extraordinary rise of farmers' markets in recent years, it is part of a new foodscape emerging in this country and around the world. Another world is possible, anti-globalization activists chanted 10 years ago. Food has become a demonstration model of what that world could be and is. 6. Tending our gardens. Is it enough? At the end of his novella Candide, a fiercely comic review of all the calamities and brutalities of the mid-18th century world, Voltaire concluded, "We must tend our gardens." It's an enigmatic comment. Is it a statement of defeat? We must all retreat to a safe space, for we can do no more. Or is it a manifesto for tending the garden as a metaphor for a larger set of intentions and interventions? Is the world our garden that we must tend, or is the garden a retreat from the rough world? There's a wonderful passage in Robert Richardson's biography of Thoreau in which he speaks of the Europe-wide revolution of 1848, says of the New England milieu and its proliferating cooperative communities at the time. Most of the founders were more interested in building models, which would be emulated because they succeeded, than in the destruction of the existing order. Still, American utopian socialism had much in common with the spirit of 1848. He's saying that you can revolt either by smashing the existing order or by founding an alternative outside that order. The old idea of revolution is that you would violently conquer the state, and yourself become the state, and then you as the state would institute or permit the better society or economy you hoped for. That's actually a roundabout way to do things, and the state seems to a lot of people nowadays more like a problem than a solution. The worldview neoliberals and anarchists share. A lot of revolutions corroded when they became the state. In other words, you can reach out and change the state and its institutions, which we recognize as revolution, or you can make your own institutions beyond the reach of the state or outside its gaze, which can also be revolutionary. This creating rather than simply rebelling has been much of the nature of revolution in our time, as people reinvent family, gender, food systems, work, housing, education, economics, medicine, and doctor-patient relations, news reportage, the imagination of the environment, and the language to talk about it, and more aspects of everyday life. The fantasy of a revolution is that it will suddenly make everything different, and regime revolutions generally make a difference, sometimes a significantly positive one. But the making of radical differences in everyday life is a more protracted, incremental, everyday process. Something like same-sex marriage does not ask the state to make change, but to recognize changes that have already been made, privately, individually, incrementally, as same-sex couples set up their lives in liberation from old restrictions. The question then is, can you have a revolution where everybody just abandons the existing system until it crumbles? Or does that give this existing system free space in which to operate? Tending your garden does not, for example, confront the problem of Monsanto. And, maybe all of you know kind of the trajectory of Monsanto, which is now the world's largest transgenic seed producer, arguably is attempting to control the food chain with these patented seeds, and which was really about creating the transgenic produce and then kind of trying to control the whole system and ultimately trying to take over the world through farming and seeds. And you need an attack, not a retreat, to deal with Monsanto. You can't just hope that everybody will withdraw from this predatory monopolistic company. And given that Monsanto's crops are contaminating non-GMO crops, the problem is not theirs or out there, it's ours, and it could be everywhere. The farmers of South Dakota launched one such attack earlier in this decade. Remember for our purposes now that a farm at its very best is a large garden, though it is very often instead a large outdoor factory. Monsanto went into the seed business in large part to create genetically altered seeds that are immune to its major product, the herbicide Roundup, so that farmers will buy both the seed and the herbicide. The resultant landscape is a harsh monoculture of one single kind of plant and one single corporation. Under Monsanto's regime, farmers are not allowed to plant their own seeds, but must each year buy seed from the corporation. The corporation giveth and it taketh away. The South Dakota farmers, who are socially conservative in many ways, but had a progressive era legacy of cooperatively owned co-ops, grain elevators, mills, and banks, organized when Monsanto attempted to introduce GM wheat into their region as the first place they're going to do it on Earth. They so effectively fought Monsanto that the corporation canceled the GMO wheat it had sought to introduce throughout the world. As Ted Nace wrote, on May 10, 2004, Monsanto bowed to the prevailing political sentiment. It issued a curt press release announcing the withdrawal of all its pending regulatory applications for Roundup-ready wheat and the shifting of research priorities to other crops. The main factor in the decision, the company noted obliquely, was, quote, a lack of widespread wheat industry alignment, unquote. which was, of course, entirely true, but the gardens were protected by people leaving those gardens or farms and gathering in public space. While many of the pioneers of urban agriculture have high public profiles or have made gardens that are themselves community space, others have viewed the garden as a retreat, a way to step away from politics. There's a strong American desire to live a virtuous life and hope that's enough, to avoid the fray, and the garden as a retreat is avoidance, though we've now seen enough gardens as attacks and as political sites to see how malleable an act gardening can be. 7. The fungus privatization and the pest diffidence. The pervasive tendency of Americans and of those in many other parts of the global north has been towards privatization, a state that is economic, spatial, and emotional all at once. Something very peculiar has taken place during the last quarter century. As the social contract has in many ways and places been dismantled, the public arena abandoned, and with it the sense of existing in a shared realm where your gain and your loss are also mine, where we are tied together in a common fellowship that might be a civilization or a community or a nation. What began as tax revolts a quarter century or so ago dismantled the recently built shelters for the poor, the young, the mad, the damaged. Shelters that were economic or social services were provided as an expression of solidarity and of security. For if we could provide for anyone to whom the worst had happened, then none of us need fear that worst so much as before. But the great overarching roof of social programs was dismantled. The mad were let go into the streets, and the armies of the homeless who pushed their shopping carts through the 1980s and the 90s and continued drifting through the inhospitable asphalt wilderness of the new millennium appeared as almost everyone quickly forgot that life had been otherwise not so long ago. In this brutal new world of unmitigated market forces, nothing remained yours but the space that you paid for, a realm shrunken back to the bounds of private property, with phantasmagorical fears chewing at the edges, whether criminals. The nice statistic being that the more you stayed home and watched local TV news, the more afraid you were to leave the house. Or immigrants or germs, a host of others to be kept out. This is why each house had to be set up at least imaginatively as completely autonomous, with its home entertainment center replacing the old communal movie houses, with a set of weights in the garage for many, a private gym for the few, for isolation, even though these houses and their reliance on electricity, gas, water, and other services remained, in fact, a part of a shared network. This withdrawal from the community was an ideology and an imaginary space more than an actuality, except in the case of the few survivalists in the backwoods who weren't living entirely off canned goods and trucked in propane. The philosophy behind this retreat from public life was capitalism. The argument against the public good was buttressed by private good. Who needed good tap water when it was buyable in bottles? Who needed public schools when there were private academies? Who needed to undermine the causes of crime and provide public protection for the victims when private security forces and gated communities were mushrooming so spectacularly? All this was the backdrop to the rising obsession with home ownership and home improvement, of which the gardens seemed to partake at times. We must all tend our gardens can be the mumbled rallying cry of a retreat to privatized space. I'll raise my own food and to hell with you. Fortunately, the model is more often of community and public gardens so that the axe and its harvests are collective. But for the non-homeless, this retreat was into a house that was once again a fortress that had been in various perilous paths. But this time the world had been made unstable for the sake of tax cuts and privatization. The old modernist dream of a better world had become the dream of a better home and garden. The 21st century American housing boom was globalized anyway because it was fed by artificially low interest rates held down by the new Republican administration and backed by massive investment from China, situated as purchases of extremely low or even negative yield treasury bonds. China did this to keep its own economy from booming into a rising yuan and living standard that would undermine its status as the world's great discount manufacturer. The U.S. did this to keep its own economy from sliding into depression. For a little while. Which is to say that a withdrawal from public life and national ideals can have consequences in those spheres anyway. The bust of the housing boom means that many people are literally being forced out of their foreclosed upon houses into the public spaces of homelessness. But will this become a vibrant public space or a dumping ground? The news on the tent cities in places like Sacramento is quite interesting. We may witness a new kind of homesteader, sharecropper, squatter revolt, but it's not there yet. The farmers of South Dakota made of public life a vital thing. They left their farms and came together to defeat Monsanto. It's important that the garden not become a means merely of staying within the polite, unsocial space of private property. Small is beautiful, and farmers' markets are a good partial answer to Walmart. But there comes a time when you need a big answer to big problems. Americans are still polluted by the Puritan tradition. We are too prone to look for ways to be pure rather than effective, to choose the acts that demonstrate our own blameless virtue, rather than reach out to rearrange the circumstances under which we all toil. That reaching out often involves compromise, imperfection, finding common ground, and other things that can sully a sense of purity. Though if a garden has any inherent moral, it's surely about getting your hands dirty. The garden can too readily become a site of individual virtue that is first of all individual, my garden and not yours, my solution and not ours. This matters when the garden as model is mistaken for the garden as full-fledged solution. Though just as there's a spectrum of gardens from boutique to guerrilla, so there's a spectrum from symbolic to practical. An article recently stated that 250,000 Detroiters are eating from the city's gardens. That's a full-blown solution, even if it's incomplete. I'm leaving out, there's so many other ways we could go. Backyard chickens are a big part of this phenomenon, urban beehives, and etc. But so this withdrawal into this privatization that's been so much the tenor of the last few decades is one of the things I fear that gardens may accommodate all too well. The other thing I fear is the diffidence of the young. I've been arguing the last few years about the state of American youth with baby boomers who want to believe that subsequent generations have dropped the banner of idealism that they themselves once carried so high. I hasten to point out to these boomers the anti-sweatshop and justice for janitor campus solidarity movements of recent years and the significant minority of young people involved in other direct action campaigns. But most of all, I argue that the very tenor of these young American lives is an act of resistance to, among other things, becoming like such boomers themselves and passing summary judgment on strangers. Of course, this combativeness is a sign of my own boomer cusp status. The young, I often admire their lovely diffidence, the modesty that manifests as a refusal to tell other people what to do, a careful avoidance of all soapboxes and pulpits, or I admire it up to a point perhaps defined as the pinnacle of moral refinement beyond which lies a slippery slope. Small is beautiful, but too willfully small can become ineffectual, evasive, or trivial. I see the insurrectionary diffidence of the privileged young around me as inspired by this up to a point. It's as though they vowed to never be bullies again, but in so doing find it hard to stand up for and to things. I like the humility, the gentleness, but I want those who come after me to dream big dreams and try to change the world, to feel powerful with all the burden and opportunity that goes with that power. Engage withdrawal, the term for the creation of alternatives, and the refusal to participate in what is seen as corrupt, can be an effective mode of social and political change, but sometimes engagement advance, if not attack, is necessary. I fear that the garden can become a site of this withdrawal, this privatization that's first of all always psychological, that in tending our own gardens we may neglect the world. The wheat farmers of South Dakota left their farms to fight the power, and the gardens of Detroit and Milwaukee are places where people meet as a community to solve major problems. Communities, in one sense, a crop being cultivated there. Tending our gardens is only an answer if the world is imagined as a potential garden, and the tools can reach out on the grand scale to dig deeper and demand better harvests. Thank you.